Hi everyone, my name is Isabella Villanueva and my partner is Brittany Sanchez. We are going to be covering queer theory, literary criticism, and the comparison to the devourings. So we are going to start off with what is queer theory. Queer theory is an umbrella term that became popular in the 1990s by the LGBTQIA community. This is following the feminist theory that became popular in the 1980s as gay and lesbian critics were more critical in the university setting. The word queer was rebranded previously from homophobic prejudice onto a new label that covers all that deviates from what is considered normal and accepted. In this case, it would be heteronormative tendencies. And then those that apply queer theory to literature and societal context, they argue that actions speak to identity rather than biological makeup from birth. So this would kind of tackle how gender and identity and sexual identity are all fluid forms. And rather than the binary or biological identity that we believe we are born with, it goes against that idea, and to say that our performance supports who we are and that we do not have a label to start with. This would be applied to, of course, literature and as well as academic texts for future references.
Okay, so I would like to start off by talking about what the topic of queer theory is. So in our textbook, Arguing About Literature, it presents this idea that queer theory is, or it seeks to reveal and discredit long-held stereotypes of gay and lesbian fictional characters. So in general, what queer theory is stating is that as a society, we've come to see heterosexuality as the norm. So we say that society privileges heterosexual behavior and then it marginalizes any deviation from those norms. So furthermore, the popularized lesbian theorist Adrienne Rich presents the idea of compulsive heterosexuality. And compulsive heterosexuality states that dominant straight culture unthinkingly socializes us to see heterosexuality as a given, the taken for granted default sexual identity for all. So same-sex relationships end up suffering the disempowering injustices allotted to those judged as abnormal. We've come to see that sexual identity is not stable or an absolute given, and the idea of sexual identity is actually a fluid or it's contingent, can be seen as a bridge to queer theory. So queer theorists, what they're doing is that they're trying to debunk and they're trying to question conventional gender identity and roles. They're trying to basically say this is what the norm is, this is what society has believed for so long, which is, as I stated, the concept of heterosexuality. And they're trying to say that that is not the only norm.
All right, so we're going to be going into the historical context to better explain queer theory. Some key events that come before queer theory are the Stonewall riots, the ACT UP movement, and then, of course, the other liberation movements and what they were aiming to do. In the Stonewall riots in June 1969, they were widely recognized as a turning point for the LGBTQ plus rights movement. They sparked the creation of new activist organizations such as the Gay Liberation Front. And then this, of course, laid the foundation for the first Pride parades. And this also led to Pride Month, which is in June. And then in the 80s, there was an AIDS epidemic. And this was killing off the population of the LGBTQ plus community, and research was not being done and action was not being taken. Therefore, the group ACT UP was formed, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. They were demanding government action, medical research, and public awareness, and this led to protests, again, to raise awareness and to fight for the rights of the community. And then the gay and lesbian liberation movements overall in the 1980s and 90s are examples of queer theory in activism form. The groups were pushing for anti-discrimination laws, they were fighting censorship, and they were working to raise visibility in politics and media. And then in queer theory, the presumed sexual identity, which is heterosexual, the theory is challenging it to view sexual liberation as something that is going against the norm in relation to sex, sexuality, and gender.
What are the key concepts of queer theory? The first key concept that we can find is in the Embodied Philosophy article by Kyle Jacob. In this article, he presents the findings of McCann and Monaghan, and they hint at queer theory as a lens that emphasizes the slipperiness of meaning and the transgression of categories and boundaries. It's all about pushing boundaries and questioning the norm. So queer theorists have therefore generally been more interested in not just defining what queer theory is, but rather trying to forge a path for what it does, what it's capable of doing, and what it can bring to society. Further, in the article by EU International Relations, authors Steven McClinchy, Rosie Waters, and Christian Sleinflug, they state that questioning the queer theory questions socially established norms and dualistic categories, with a special focus on challenging sexual, heterosexual, and homosexual, gender, male and female, class, rich and poor, and racial, white and non-white classifications. So just as feminists perceive gender, queer theorists argue in regards to sexuality and gender expression. And we can present this topic of queer theory in a more current light, as this split of sexual equality has actually become even more pronounced as the international politics of sexual orientation and gender identity receives an ever-increasing degree of public attention. For instance, a current issue is the debate of transgender individuals being able to use their own toilet. And finally, the masterclass article summarizes queer theory as it opens new avenues of thought to define concepts considered central to identity and identity politics. They state that queer theory doesn't deny that people deserve equal rights, but rather that the basis of these rights should not be due to any kind of innate or unchangeable identity.
So we're going to be talking about terms that were created by queer theorists to help us better understand queer theory in literary criticism. Adrienne Rich, mentioned by the author, is a lesbian theorist, and she gave birth to these two terms, compulsive heterosexuality and lesbian continuum. Compulsive heterosexuality conditions us to assume straightness as the natural norm, which in turn leads to the unfair treatment and diminished legitimacy of same-sex relationships. So this goes on to say that the natural norm or heteronormative tendencies that are built into society are forced upon us, and this leads to unfair treatment to those that are in same-sex relationships. And then the other term, lesbian continuum, refers to the fact that sexual identity is not rigid but is more accurately viewed as flexible and influenced by context. The context would be actions seen as homosocial, homoerotic, and homosexual. So homosocial would refer to actions such as playing or just being together in each other's company, and homoerotic would refer to two people of the same sex performing an erotic nature, and then homosexual would of course refer to the two people of the same sex being in a relationship and of course being together. And then Judith Butler gave birth to the concept of gender performativity, and according to the Fivable Guide, he argues that gender is not a natural or fixed identity, but instead supported by continuous performance. So this kind of relates to the lesbian continuum concept brought up by Adrienne. He is arguing that gender is supported by ongoing action instead of a prefixed identity from birth or from biological form.
In the short story, The Devourings by Amy Bender, this presents the concept, the overall theme of grief and loss in a fairy tale form. The story begins with a human woman who marries an ogre. The human woman, as the author describes, was ugly by human standards, and she marries the ogre because he was strong and productive. The two get married and have a regular life, and they have 6 children. There comes one night when the ogre is out and the human woman is greeted by 6 human children at her door. Due to human instincts, she lets them in, but knows that she has to hide them so that they won't be eaten by her husband. The 6 human children are very smart, and they are wearing red felt hats. The ogre children are wearing crowns when they went to bed. And so the human children switch the hats with the crowns, and therefore, when the ogre comes home, although he does smell the human scent, he is tricked, as he believes his children are wearing the crowns, and he ends up eating his 6 ogre children. This obviously creates a very devastating event, and it leads to the human woman having a lot of grief and loss. The human woman ends up leaving her husband and going out and living in nature. She has a replenishing cake and a magic cloak that she relies on. Towards the end of the short story, she lets go of the replenishing cake and the magic cloak, and she just lives off of the land. She ends up seeing her ogre husband one day, and although she does have fear, she misses him a lot, and she knows that he misses her, and she returns to her husband. There are several main key themes presented in the short story The Devourings, the first being humanity versus monstrosity. Humanity versus monstrosity basically explores the idea that there is good and evil between all. Although the ogre is considered a monster, or obviously an ogre, he does experience human emotions such as love and grief, and there is connection, as we can see, between the human woman and the ogre. So it's challenging the norm. It's presenting and it's pushing boundaries just as queer theory does. And then the second would be the use of fairy tale. So the idea of how to deal with grief is disguised as a fairy tale in this short story. As the author, Rachel Sandell, presents in her April 2025 book review, this is a magic world where human women can have children with ogres, and it presents the central idea of magical realism. As well, the little human children switching places with the ogre children to throw off the ogre's scent is familiar with the whimsical yet dark nature of the Brothers Grimm. Finally, the use of the cake and the cloak in the end of the story creates a new symbolism and concept of fairy tale. Basically, the cake symbolizes how trauma extends beyond one's lifetime, and it can affect people across many generations. And then in coordination with the use of the cloak and the presentation of lightness and darkness that we read about in the end of the short story, the cake manages to find a resolution with this trauma.
So, additional key themes that are explored in the short story are love and forgiveness and character transformation. As far as love and forgiveness, we see the ogre and the woman develop a loving relationship through their complexity and through the non-normative desire that they have for each other. We see their relationship flourish into a marriage with children. And then there is a forgiveness part that comes with the aspect of love that Bender introduces us to. Bender portrays forgiveness not as clear-cut, but rather complex, because you can see the woman go through an inner turmoil and a moral uncertainty after the children are eaten. The woman's journey into the forest mirrors a psychological journey through trauma, ultimately leading to growth and change. So the magical cloak and the cake serve as her process through trauma. And then this leads to their love persisting in the aftermath in violence and grief. She goes through a reflection process later, which is transformative. When she sees that the ogre has an emotional consciousness over his actions, she realizes that he does have emotion and he is able to think more about what he is doing instead of acting on instinct, because there is a part in the story where she sees him throw up a human with the parts coming out, and in this case, instead of fully eating a human, he throws up in disgust. And this is one of the examples where we can see that the ogre has changed, and then the perception of the ogre that the woman originally had has changed because she can see that he does have a different side to him.
So how does the Devouring short story relate to queer theory? The first concept is, again, the idea of humanity versus monstrosity, and how this relates to non-normative queer thinking. So the story centers on a woman who marries an ogre with a history of devouring people, including his first wife and children. In their relationship, the human women and the ogre is marked by a mixture of tenderness, violence, taboo, and transformation. This dynamic disrupts heteronormative expectations of marriage, intimacy, and parental roles. Queer theory invites readers to explore how desire operates outside socially sanctioned norms, and here, the woman's acceptance of her husband's monstrous past reflects a broader questioning of what love and desire are supposed to look like. Essentially, we're pushing boundaries, and the short story is questioning the norms that we have.
So one of the key themes in the Devourings was character transformation, and this directly relates to identity and fluidity in queer theory. The ogre and woman undergo emotional and relational transformation, showing that healing is not so much about the moral redemption, but more so about adapting to grief, trauma, and rehabilitating love. This is all done with behavior, action, and analyzation. And queer theory views that identity is fluid, and it's not fixed, and it's supported by behavior and performance. And as we examined before with the queer theorists, Adrienne Rich and Judith, we saw their terms and how they were defined. Lesbian Continuum listed that the behaviors of same-sex relationships support the continuum. And in gender performativity, Judith further explains that we are identified by our actions and not so much the binary label that we are born with.